There is a moment in war when everything stops, when the noise of artillery fades into a terrible silence, when the jungle holds its breath, when one man stands on a dirt road, watching 5 steel machines roll toward him, and decides that this is where it ends. Not for him, for them. What happened on December 15, 1944, on a forgotten stretch of road in the Philippine jungle defies belief. It should not have been possible. By every measure of military science, probability, and common sense, it should have ended differently. But it did not. This is the story of Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug and the 5 tanks he destroyed alone. The island of Leyte lies in the central Philippines, a landmass of volcanic mountains, dense jungle, and narrow coastal plains that in the autumn of 1944 became the hinge upon which the entire Pacific War would turn. When General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Red Beach on October 20th, fulfilling his dramatic promise to return, he set in motion one of the most brutal and consequential campaigns of the Second World War. The Japanese understood what the Americans did not yet fully grasp. Leyte was not simply another island to be taken and held. It was the gateway to Luzon, to Manila, to the heart of Japanese power in Southeast Asia. Lose Leyte, and the entire defensive perimeter would collapse. And so they fought with the desperation of men who knew that every yard of ground surrendered brought the enemy closer to the home islands. The Battle of Leyte was not a single engagement, but a sprawling, chaotic contest that raged across jungle ridges, rice paddies, swamps, and coastal roads for more than 2 months. The Japanese 35th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sasaku Suzuki, was determined to hold the island at any cost. Fresh divisions were rushed in from Luzon, Manchuria, and even Japan itself, despite American control of the surrounding seas. They came in convoys that ran the gauntlet of submarines and aircraft, accepting catastrophic losses for the chance to reinforce the garrison. The Americans, meanwhile, poured men and materiel into the beachheads, driving inland through terrain that seemed designed to frustrate every advantage they possessed. The jungle was a living obstacle. Vines thick as rope tangled between trees that rose 100 feet into the canopy, blocking the sun and turning the forest floor into perpetual twilight. Rain fell in torrents that transformed dirt roads into rivers of mud and turned dry creek beds into raging floods in minutes. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Ambushes could happen anywhere. The heat was suffocating, the humidity absolute. Men soaked through their uniforms in minutes, and the moisture never dried. Boots rotted on their feet. Weapons rusted despite constant cleaning. Insects swarmed in clouds. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery claimed as many casualties as Japanese bullets. By early December, the American advance had stalled along a network of roads and trails that threaded through the mountains and jungles of central Leyte. The Japanese had established a series of defensive lines, anchored on terrain features that commanded the approaches to Ormoc, the last major port still in their hands on the western coast. Ormoc was the lifeline through which reinforcements and supplies continued to flow, and its capture was essential to ending organized resistance on the island. The Americans pushed westward from the eastern beachheads, following narrow roads that snaked through valleys and over ridges, contested at every turn by an enemy who had nowhere left to retreat. The fighting was intimate and savage. Foxholes were dug within grenade range of one another. Firefights erupted at point-blank range in the jungle gloom. Small unit actions, squad against squad, became the norm. Officers and sergeants made decisions that affected the course of battles without any contact with higher command, because radios did not work under the canopy, and runners took hours to traverse distances that looked insignificant on a map. Into this maelstrom came Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug, a young soldier from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who had enlisted in the Army in 1942 and shipped out to the Pacific with the 96th Infantry Division. He was not a career soldier. He had not been raised in a military family or attended a prestigious academy. He was the son of Dutch immigrants, a young man who had worked with his hands and knew the value of steady labor. He was quiet, unassuming, and conscientious. His officers would later describe him as reliable, the kind of soldier who did what was asked of him without complaint or drama. He had been trained as a bazooka man, a specialization that required both technical skill and considerable courage. The M9 bazooka was a tube-launched rocket weapon designed to destroy armored vehicles and fortified positions. It was effective but cumbersome, requiring the operator to expose himself while aiming and firing, and to remain stationary during the launch sequence. The backblast from the rocket motor could reveal the operator's position to every enemy soldier within 100 yards. Reloading was slow, and each rocket weighed several pounds. A bazooka team typically consisted of 2 men, one to fire and one to load, because the weapon was nearly useless in the hands of a single operator under combat conditions. But doctrine and reality often diverged in the jungles of Leyte. The Ormoc Road was one of the few improved routes that connected the eastern and western coasts of the island, and its control was a matter of operational necessity for both sides. The Americans needed it to move supplies and reinforcements westward for the final push on Ormoc. The Japanese needed it to move men and equipment eastward to contain the American beachheads and prevent a complete encirclement. By mid-December, the road had become a no-man's land, a contested strip of dirt and gravel that changed hands with each engagement, littered with the wreckage of vehicles and the debris of battle. Roadblocks were established at key choke points, positions where the jungle pressed close on both sides and where the road narrowed or curved, creating natural ambush sites. These roadblocks were manned by small detachments, usually a squad or less, armed with machine guns, rifles, and occasionally a bazooka. Their mission was simple: hold the road, deny the enemy freedom of movement, call for reinforcements if contact was made. But in the chaos of the Leyte Campaign, reinforcements were never guaranteed, and the men at the roadblocks understood that they might be on their own. On the morning of December 15th, Vlug was assigned to a roadblock several miles east of Ormoc, a position that overlooked a straight section of the road with good fields of fire in both directions. The position had been established the previous day, and the squad had dug shallow fighting positions along the roadside, using fallen logs and the natural terrain for cover. There was no time to construct elaborate fortifications. The ground was too wet, and the threat of counterattack too immediate. The men worked in shifts, watching the road, cleaning weapons, eating cold rations, and waiting. The jungle around them was alive with sound. Birds called from the canopy. Insects hummed. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant surf, but beneath that natural symphony the men listened for other sounds: the clink of equipment, the snap of a twig, the murmur of voices, anything that would signal the approach of the enemy. The tension was constant and exhausting. Every shadow could conceal a sniper. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be the prelude to an assault. The waiting was worse than the fighting, because the mind filled the silence with fear. At approximately 1400 hours, the sound of engines reached the roadblock. It was faint at first, a low mechanical growl that rose and fell with the contours of the terrain. The men tensed, checking their weapons, peering down the road through the green haze of the jungle. Engines meant vehicles. Vehicles meant armor or supply trucks. Either way, it meant contact. The squad leader sent a runner back toward the company command post, but the distance was too great and the jungle too thick for any hope of immediate support. Whatever was coming, the men at the roadblock would face it alone. The sound grew louder, resolving into the distinct clatter of tank tracks on gravel. The rhythm was unmistakable, a metallic percussion that carried through the trees like a drumbeat. Then the first tank appeared around the curve, followed by a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 Type 95 Hago light tanks, moving in column formation, advancing steadily down the center of the road. The Hago was the standard light tank of the Imperial Japanese Army, a vehicle that had been designed in the mid-1930s for colonial policing and infantry support in China. It weighed less than 8 tons, was crewed by 3 men, and mounted a 37mm main gun in a small turret, along with two 7.7mm machine guns. By the standards of 1944, it was obsolete. American M4 Sherman tanks outweighed it by a factor of 4, outgunned it, and outarmored it by a wide margin. But the Hago was not designed to fight other tanks. It was designed to support infantry, to overrun defensive positions, and to exploit breakthroughs. Its armor was thin, barely sufficient to stop rifle-caliber ammunition, but that was enough against an enemy armed only with small arms. Its gun was weak by tank standards, but devastating against troops in the open. Its speed and maneuverability were its greatest assets, allowing it to move quickly through terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. And in the jungles of Leyte, where American armor was often road-bound and unable to maneuver, the Hago remained a serious threat. The appearance of 5 tanks moving together was unusual. Japanese armor on Leyte had been depleted by attrition, and most surviving tanks were being held in reserve for the final defense of Ormoc. The fact that these 5 had been committed to a road march suggested that something important was happening. Perhaps a counterattack was planned. Perhaps they were escorting a supply convoy. Perhaps they were simply trying to reach another position before darkness fell. Whatever their mission, their presence on the Ormoc Road at that moment represented a significant threat to American operations. If they broke through the roadblock, they would have free access to the rear areas of the American advance. Supply dumps, command posts, medical stations, all the vulnerable infrastructure of a modern army would be exposed. The consequences would be immediate and severe. The squad at the roadblock opened fire with rifles and a Browning .30 caliber machine gun, but the small arms fire was ineffective against the tanks. Bullets sparked off the armor and ricocheted into the jungle, but the tanks did not slow. They could not be stopped by rifle fire. The only weapon capable of destroying them was the bazooka, and Dirk Vlug was the only bazooka man present. The rest of the squad had been dispersed along the roadblock or sent on other tasks. There was no loader. No second team, just Vlug, the bazooka, and 6 rockets. In a textbook engagement, this would have been unthinkable. A single bazooka operator against 5 tanks was not a fight. It was suicide. The standard doctrine called for multiple rocket teams working in coordination, with infantry support to suppress enemy fire and protect the bazooka operators during the vulnerable moments of aiming and reloading. But there was no time for doctrine, no time to wait for support, no time to reposition or withdraw. The tanks were coming, and someone had to stop them. Vlug made his decision. He would later say that there was no grand calculation, no moment of philosophical clarity. There was simply the understanding that the road had to be held, and that he was the only one who could do it. He picked up the bazooka, slung the bag of rockets over his shoulder, and stepped out of cover. His squad mates watched in disbelief as he moved forward, walking into the open, directly toward the advancing tanks. One of them shouted at him to get back, to take cover, but Vlug did not respond. He walked to the center of the road, knelt down, and raised the bazooka to his shoulder. The first tank was less than 75 yards away and closing fast. The turret swung toward him, the barrel of the 37mm gun tracking across the road. The machine guns began to fire, kicking up dirt and gravel around him. The sound was deafening, a sustained roar of gunfire and engine noise that drowned out everything else. Vlug aimed, exhaled, and fired. The rocket left the tube with a hiss and a blast of flame that erupted from the rear of the bazooka. The projectile flew straight and true, covering the distance to the target in a fraction of a second, and struck the lead tank just below the turret ring. The shaped charge detonated on impact, focusing the explosive energy into a superheated jet of metal that punched through the armor and into the crew compartment. The effect was instantaneous. Fire bloomed inside the tank. The crew had no time to react, no time to escape. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from the hatches, flames licking at the edges of the hull. The second tank swerved to avoid the burning wreck, tracks churning the dirt as it tried to maneuver around the obstruction. The road was narrow and the jungle pressed close on both sides. There was no room to deploy off-road, no space to flank. The tanks were trapped in a fatal funnel, and Vlug was standing at the narrow end. He reloaded. It was a deliberate process that required precision and calm under conditions that were anything but calm. He had to remove the spent tube from the launcher, retrieve a fresh rocket from the bag, insert it into the launcher, connect the electrical firing mechanism, and raise the weapon again to his shoulder. All of this while machine gun bullets snapped through the air around him, while tank engines roared and tracks clattered, while every instinct screamed at him to run. But he did not run. He raised the bazooka, aimed at the second tank, and fired again. Another hit. The second tank exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that sent debris arcing into the jungle. The column was now blocked by 2 burning wrecks, but the remaining 3 tanks continued to advance, pushing forward, trying to ram the obstacles aside or find a way past. Their commanders understood that stopping meant death. The only chance was to keep moving, to overrun the enemy position, to break through. But Vlug was not finished. He reloaded a third time, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos. The third tank fired its main gun, the round screaming past him and detonating somewhere in the jungle behind the roadblock. The blast wave struck him like a physical blow, but he stayed on his feet. He aimed and fired. The third tank died. The fourth tank tried to reverse, backing away from the carnage, but the road was too narrow and the jungle too thick. It could not turn around. It could not escape. Vlug reloaded and fired a fourth time. The rocket struck the fourth tank in the side, penetrating the thin armor and destroying it. 4 tanks down, 1 rocket remaining, 1 tank still advancing. The fifth tank was directly in front of him now, less than 50 yards away. Its machine guns were firing continuously, raking the road and the jungle edge. The squad had stopped shooting, transfixed by what they were witnessing. The tank commander, perhaps realizing that the bazooka was the only threat, focused all fire on Vlug. Rounds struck the ground at his feet, tore through his uniform, grazed his skin, but none found a vital area. He loaded the 5th and final rocket, raised the bazooka one last time, and fired. The rocket struck the 5th tank in the front glacis, just above the driver's hatch. The tank shuddered, stopped, and caught fire. All 5 tanks were destroyed. But the fight was not over. The hatches of the 5th tank burst open, and the crew began to bail out, desperate to escape the inferno inside. Japanese tankers wore leather helmets and carried pistols or submachine guns for close defense. They emerged into a kill zone, surrounded by wreckage and fire, and found themselves face to face with the man who had destroyed their entire column. Vlug dropped the empty bazooka, drew his Colt 1911 .45 caliber pistol, and engaged the surviving crew members at close range. The engagement was brutal and short. The pistol barked, each shot a sharp crack that punctuated the roar of burning fuel and exploding ammunition. When it was over, the crew lay dead beside their tank. The road was silent except for the crackle of flames and the hiss of escaping steam. Vlug stood alone in the center of the carnage, surrounded by the twisted metal corpses of 5 tanks, and waited for his squad to reach him. They came forward slowly, moving through the smoke, weapons ready, unable to fully process what they had just witnessed. 1 man against 5 tanks, 5 rockets, 5 kills. It was impossible, and yet they had seen it happen. Vlug was calm, almost detached. He checked his pistol, reloaded it, holstered it, and then began to collect the spent rocket tubes. The squad leader asked if he was hit. Vlug looked down at himself, noticed the torn fabric and the blood, and shrugged. Superficial wounds, nothing serious. The squad leader shook his head and sent another runner back to report the contact. When the after-action report reached battalion headquarters, the officers did not believe it. 5 tanks destroyed by a single bazooka operator. Impossible. They sent a team forward to verify the claim, and the team returned with photographs and measurements. 5 Type 95 Hago tanks, destroyed at ranges between 30 and 75 yards, all along a single stretch of road. The evidence was undeniable. The immediate tactical impact of the engagement was significant. The destruction of the tank column halted a planned Japanese counterattack and kept the Ormoc Road open for American use. The supplies and reinforcements that would have been delayed or destroyed by the breakthrough arrived on schedule, and the advance continued. Within days, Ormoc fell, and organized Japanese resistance on Leyte began to collapse. The campaign would continue for weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. And in the cold calculus of military operations, one man's actions had contributed to that outcome in a measurable way. But the significance of what Dirk Vlug had done extended beyond tactics and strategy. It entered the realm of the mythic, the improbable, the stories that soldiers tell each other in the darkness to remind themselves that courage still exists in the world. The Medal of Honor was awarded to Vlug in a ceremony months later, after the war had moved on to Luzon and Okinawa, after the atomic bombs had fallen and Japan had surrendered. The citation was read aloud, and the medal was pinned to his chest, and he stood at attention while cameras clicked and officers saluted. But he did not speak about what he had done. He did not give interviews or write memoirs. He accepted the honor with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his actions on the Ormoc Road, and then he went home. He returned to Grand Rapids, Michigan, married, raised a family, and worked for the United States Postal Service as a mail carrier. He walked the same routes year after year, delivering letters and packages, greeting neighbors, living an ordinary life. No one who saw him on the street would have known what he had done. No one would have guessed that the quiet man in the postal uniform had once stood alone on a jungle road and stopped 5 tanks with 5 rockets and a pistol. This is the paradox of war and heroism. The men who perform the most extraordinary acts are often the least inclined to speak of them. They do not see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as men who did what was necessary, what their duty demanded, what the circumstances required. Vlug never claimed that he was brave. He never suggested that he was special. He simply said that someone had to stop the tanks, and he was the one with the bazooka. This humility, this refusal to mythologize his own actions, is perhaps the most profound aspect of his story. It reminds us that heroism is not about self-aggrandizement or glory. It is about the willingness to stand when others would run, to act when others would freeze, to accept risk and danger for a purpose greater than oneself. The story of Dirk Vlug forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about courage and fear. What enables one man to walk into the face of death while others seek cover? Is it training? Is it temperament? Is it some quality of character that cannot be taught or learned? Psychologists and military theorists have studied this question for decades, and the answers remain elusive. Some men discover reserves of courage they did not know they possessed when confronted with crisis. Others, equally trained and prepared, find that fear overwhelms them. There is no shame in this. Fear is a rational response to danger, and the survival instinct is strong. What Vlug did on December 15, 1944 was not rational. It was not safe. It was not the product of careful calculation. It was an act of will, a decision to place mission above survival, duty above self-preservation. And the fact that he survived, that he walked away from that road and lived to old age, should not diminish the magnitude of the risk he accepted. The 5 tanks he destroyed were crewed by men who believed in their mission as deeply as Vlug believed in his. They were not monsters or fanatics. They were soldiers following orders, trying to complete their assignment, fighting for a cause that made sense to them within the context of their culture and their understanding of the war. They died because they encountered an obstacle they could not overcome, a man who refused to yield. War creates these collisions, these moments when 2 groups of human beings, each convinced of their rightness, meet in violence. The outcome is determined by skill, equipment, terrain, and luck. On the Ormoc Road, Vlug had the right weapon, the right position, and the will to use them. The Japanese tankers had courage and determination, but it was not enough. They died in the flames of their vehicles, far from home, on an island most of them had never heard of before the war. Their sacrifice deserves acknowledgement, even as we recognize that their defeat was necessary for the war to end. The Leyte Campaign continued for weeks after the engagement on the Ormoc Road, but the outcome was no longer in question. The Japanese fought with desperate ferocity, launching banzai charges and suicide attacks, but they were running out of men, ammunition, and hope. The Americans pressed forward, consolidating their gains, eliminating pockets of resistance, and preparing for the next stage of the campaign. By Christmas, organized resistance had effectively ceased, though small groups of Japanese soldiers would continue to hide in the jungles for months, even years, refusing to surrender. Some were not informed that the war had ended until the 1950s, emerging from the mountains gaunt and disoriented, living ghosts of a conflict that had moved on without them. Dirk Vlug did not speak publicly about his experiences until late in his life, and even then he was reluctant. When asked by historians and journalists how he felt during the engagement, he struggled to find words. He said that he remembered the noise and the heat and the smell of burning fuel. He remembered the weight of the bazooka and the recoil against his shoulder. He remembered reloading again and again, while bullets cracked past his head. But he could not adequately describe the state of mind that allowed him to continue. It was not bravery, he insisted. It was simply a kind of focus, a narrowing of the world to the task at hand. There was the bazooka, the rockets, the tanks. Everything else ceased to exist. He did not think about death or survival. He thought about the angle of the shot, the distance to the target, the timing of the trigger pull. He did what he had been trained to do, and he did it again and again, until the threat was eliminated. This description, stripped of drama and sentimentality, may be the truest account of what heroism feels like from the inside. It is not a grand emotion or a surge of adrenaline. It is a kind of narrowing, a reduction of consciousness to the essential task. The body moves. The hands perform the necessary actions. The mind calculates distance and trajectory. Everything else is noise. And when it is over, the world expands again, and the hero realizes what he has done and feels not pride but exhaustion. Vlug returned to his position after the engagement and sat down in the dirt. His hands were shaking. His squad mates offered him water and cigarettes, and he accepted both. They asked him questions he could not answer. How did you do that? Why did you do that? What were you thinking? He had no answers. He had done what was necessary. That was all. The Medal of Honor citation was precise and factual, as such documents must be. It listed the date, the location, the number of enemy vehicles destroyed, the manner of their destruction. It noted that Vlug acted voluntarily, that he exposed himself to enemy fire, that he achieved results far beyond the normal expectations of his rank and position. It used the language of military efficiency to describe an act that transcended efficiency. But the citation could not capture the human dimension of the event. It could not convey the terror of the Japanese crews as they realized they were trapped, the awe of the American soldiers who witnessed the engagement, or the quiet determination of the man who stood in the road and refused to move. These things do not fit into official documents. They live in memory and story, passed from one generation to the next, changed and embellished with each retelling. And yet the core truth remains. On December 15, 1944, one man stopped 5 tanks alone. In the decades after the war, veterans of the Pacific Campaign gathered at reunions and spoke of the battles they had fought. They remembered Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the great set-piece battles that filled the history books. But they also remembered smaller actions, moments of individual courage that never made the headlines. They remembered the medic who ran into the open to drag a wounded man to safety. They remembered the machine gunner who held his position until he ran out of ammunition and then held it with a rifle. They remembered the bazooka man who walked toward 5 tanks and destroyed them all. These stories were told quietly, without fanfare, because the men who had been there understood that war was not glorious. It was terrible. But within that terror, there were moments when ordinary men transcended their limitations and achieved something extraordinary. And those moments mattered. Dirk Vlug lived until 1995, dying peacefully at the age of 73. His obituary in the Grand Rapids newspaper mentioned his Medal of Honor, but it focused more on his life as a husband, father, and postal worker. His family remembered him as a gentle man, patient and kind, who rarely spoke of the war. He attended veterans' events and church services, mowed his lawn and tended his garden, and lived the kind of unremarkable life that is the foundation of a decent society. But those who knew his story understood that there was nothing unremarkable about him. He carried within him the memory of a day when he stood in the fire and did not flinch. He knew what it meant to face death and choose duty. He knew what it cost to be a hero. And he bore that knowledge with humility and grace for more than 50 years. The road where it happened no longer exists in the form it did in 1944. The jungle has reclaimed much of the terrain, and modern highways have replaced the dirt tracks that once carried armies. But the memory persists. There are markers and memorials on Leyte, small plaques and monuments that commemorate the battles fought there. Veterans and historians make pilgrimages to the island, walking the ground, trying to imagine what it was like. They stand on the hillsides and look down at the valleys, and they think about the men who fought and died in those green shadows. They try to understand the fear and the courage, the chaos and the clarity, and they come away changed because they have touched something real and true about human nature. We are capable of terrible things. We are also capable of astonishing heroism. And sometimes, in the crucible of war, a single individual reminds us of what is possible when duty and courage align. This is not a story about war. It is a story about a young man from Michigan who found himself on a road in the Philippines with a weapon in his hands and a choice to make. He could have retreated. He could have waited for help. He could have done what most men would have done and sought cover, but he did not. He walked forward alone and confronted an enemy that should have killed him. And through skill, determination, and a measure of luck, he prevailed. The tanks burned. The road was held. The campaign continued, and Dirk Vlug went home and became a mail carrier. That is the story, simple, impossible, true. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about courage and duty, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can do when circumstances demand it, then take a moment to reflect. Think about the men and women in your own life who have shown quiet courage. Think about the choices you would make if you found yourself in a similar situation. And if you found value in this telling, if it helped you understand a moment in history that deserves to be remembered, then consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a like if this story resonated with you, and in the comments below, share your thoughts. What does heroism mean to you? Could you do what Dirk Vlug did? Or is it something that we can never truly know until the moment arrives? Thank you for listening. Remember these stories. Remember these men. They deserve nothing less.